Good afternoon and welcome to the sixth and final lecture in the Advocates for Balance at Chautauqua repertoire for this particular year. Our mission, and I constantly repeat it, is to achieve a balance of speakers in a mutually civil and respectful environment consistent with the historic mission of the Chautauqua Institution. As usual, we'll have a Q&A following the lecture. Please line up behind the microphone to the right there, and please silence your cell phones at this time. We already have 4 exciting speakers booked for next year, and we hope to add at least 2 more in the near future, and we may be presenting several other speakers via Zoom in the off-season. Our 6th and final speaker of the season is Dr. Peter Morici. Dr. Morici is a well-known economist, syndicated columnist, and author, heard frequently on radio and TV. Dr. Morici will discuss the economic outlook and President Biden's radical departure from other post-war presidents in economic policy, spending, regulatory priorities, taxes, international trade strategies, and that'll be about 8 o'clock tonight. We'll finish that. And their consequences for inequality, debt, inflation, and competition with China. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, and sorry for the housekeeping we had to do, Dr. Peter Morici. Peter?
It's very, very nice to be with you. I thank you for this invitation. I've never been here. I think I've got 2 purposes here. One is to talk to you about the subject, and the other is to try to convince you that economists really aren't folks that had to leave the accounting department because they didn't have quite the personality for the job. That they actually can be interesting people, okay? In any case, I'd like to talk to you about the economic program and how it juxtaposes to the challenges that we've been facing through several presidencies and have not adequately addressed. The immediate impact of the pandemic. The economy contracted significantly over a period of about 3 quarters, and 22 million people lost their jobs. The most significant thing I can tell you about where we are now is the economy is fully recovered and more in terms of GDP. But we're about at an employment level of about 5 million less than we were before the crisis. And if you do a trend line as to where we should have been with employment, we're really down 7.5 million jobs. What's happened is we have crowded into new industries or existing industries that expanded, that service us during the pandemic, things like Zooming and so forth. They tend to be very high value added. And we are providing for people other services much more efficiently. For example, a delivered meal just takes fewer people than a restaurant meal. And believe it or not, getting your groceries delivered to you requires fewer people than going to the supermarket, because after all, the food has to come from the warehouse and go on the shelves. So we're down about 7.5 million jobs. And we have many adults on the sidelines, people who have left the labor force, who've decided they don't want to adjust to these new circumstances, either because of their age or honestly, because they're getting government benefits. And until they don't get government benefits, they don't have to work. You know, you and I, the people in this room that can afford to come here, we worked for money, but we also worked for personal satisfaction. Growing up in the circumstances that I did, I know a lot of people who spend their whole lives, you know, putting cans on shelves in supermarkets. If given a choice between that and watching a game show at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, watching the game show is probably more satisfying. And if somebody sends you a check in the mail, you'll take it. And that's what it comes down to. We have essentially a situation where many jobs are gone forever. Manhattan simply isn't going to have on any average business day the same number of office workers a year from now as it had 2 years ago. Because if people show up 3 days a week instead of 5 on average, okay, some people show up 2, some 4, that sort of thing, there's going to only be 60% as many sandwiches sold at lunchtime. Those jobs are gone, kaput. The other thing is, just as you've learned to meet and do meetings with Zoom, we've learned how to do other things. You know, we're finally really rolling out the robot French fryers and hamburger flippers and things of that nature. And those things have a really, powerfully strong effect on employers. They never complain. They can't be organized by the United Service Workers Union into a group of people outside who call you a profiteering fascist, and then you pick an animal. They don't complain. Another thing that's happened, and this really blew our minds, the two things we expected was the demographers expected the economic demographers expected the divorce rate to go up and the birth rate to go up. The reason is people would be stuck at home together. A lot of people get divorced when Charlie decides to retire and stay at home. He's used to managing an organization of 200 people, and now he has all this time and energy to devote to how his wife shops. And that leads to trouble, okay? The guy retires in June. That's a customary time to retire. By the time it's October, she's had enough. And the lawyer suggests that she wait till February because that's the traditional filing season. More divorces are filed. The other thing is, normally we think about the great blackout in New York City in the 1960s. Remember that? Those of you? And what happened 9 months later? The maternity wards were all jammed, right? The thing is, the people that were at home that night had jobs. Young people were suffering from a great deal of job anxiety. And we know what happens to young people when they get anxious. They're not productive in that sense. The birth rate in the United States last year was as low as China, below 1.7 per female, terribly low. A lifetime fertility rate. You have to have a fertility rate of 2.1 to maintain the population. The only difference between us and China is we have about as many women as we do men in our youth population. They have many more males, so they're even more behind the 8 ball than we are. But don't think we don't have their problem. The other thing is, in a great number of places around the world, governments that were already pretty shaky because they were very poorly run, they were very corrupt, this pushed them over the edge. Nigeria, the oil money, corruption. Ethiopia, Haiti, places like that. That is going to have long-term consequences because the folks from the UN can show up at the White House all they want, go to the President's Conference of Democracies and lecture us all they want about our moral responsibility. We simply don't have the resources to bail them out because we can hardly bail ourselves out. Now, the world has changed. Once we get past Delta, if we don't have Epsilon, hybrid work is a permanent condition. So is hybrid education. We were already moving in that direction. A lot of MBA programs were mixed media. The students weren't coming to all the classes. Virtual shopping, medicine, and other services. The insurance companies are over it. Now they'll pay for virtual visits. It'll be very hard for them to stop doing that. There is this movement to the suburbs. Cities have basically stranded office space, which will have to be converted to. I think that Manhattan will have more residences 10 years from now than it did 10 years ago, simply because space that was being used for offices will now be used for people to live in. Because the only way they're going to get people to live in Manhattan and work there is to work in Manhattan is to create more opportunities for them to live there, because otherwise they'll want to basically hybrid from the suburbs. The other thing, I've already alluded to this, is we have a terrible mismatch between the skills of workers and the jobs that are available. We simply need fewer people in semi-skilled positions doing ordinary things that you can train someone for in about an hour. I worked at a competitor of McDonald's when I was 16. I was fully trained in an hour. Because they give you one little task to do. You're a reasonably intelligent person. You can count to 7. There's only 6 steps. Now, of that group of people, not all of them took their checks and went home. We have documented situations where, for example, Levi Strauss did this. They have been retraining workers and turning people that did ordinary jobs into basically digital workers. You don't need to go to college to learn to be very adept at certain digital skills, certain digital marketing, and so forth. If you think about it, when you were kids, a lot of the people you went to see at the bank had a high school education. Newspapers had copy editors that had a high school education. They did, I knew one. You don't have to go to have a college graduate to teach a lot of these people. And in reality, you can teach them some kind of skill in 2 or 3 or 4 months. And so there are people that went into other industries and found those opportunities. They're gone forever if you're running a restaurant in New York City. But many people just have sort of dropped out. The vaccine revolution, the RNA, the rDNA, whatever it is, technology for developing drugs is going to be transplantable to other problems. And probably drug research will never quite be the same. Remote learning will upset higher education. It's ripe. I mean, more and more it's becoming obvious that colleges don't deliver value. And just think about the advantages of remote education. Your child takes economics without the benefit of a diversity officer, a freshman book, indoctrination seminars from the president, and so forth. My president ran a great issues series because this was his year, okay? And so I suggested to him a Black female conservative who's prominent in the media and runs a think tank in Washington that would be a useful person for him to have in his series to provide balance. I don't know what his thoughts were because he never saw fit to respond to me. Now, you don't get that when you do virtual education because you basically get course modules. And there are a lot of examples that we're already developing before the pandemic, you know, teaching biology 101 from MIT to hundreds of thousands of students. Somebody is going to put that together, and it's going to be very hard to deny it accreditation. And finally, it's put the advocates of big government on the offensive because when you have a war or a pandemic, there's nothing like big government to solve certain problems. Don't think for a second that we'd have those 2 vaccines if it wasn't for that guaranteed purchase of millions of doses that the Trump administration made in Operation Warp Speed. And not to give him too much credit, because I'm sure if the other side were in, they would have done the same thing. Yeah. That kind of environment creates this notion that all of a sudden the government is efficacious. And at the same time, by creating a lot of distress and disorder in the economy, people who advocate big government can blame the private sector and therefore get on the initiative with solutions. Look, we gave you the vaccine, now we'll give you childcare. They don't tell you that childcare looks a lot like higher education. And I don't think we'll ever be able to afford to have more than 10 kids a year if we run childcare as effectively as we do higher education. Now, some lessons from history. The thing that administrations have most wanted to accomplish over the last 20 years is what existed during the Reagan-Clinton years. From Reagan to Clinton, really beginning with Carter, there was a shift in American economic policy, which I'll talk about later. But from Reagan to Clinton, the growth rate was 3.4%. In this century, it has fallen to about 2%, maybe a little less. The Obama recovery was 2.2% after he came out of the financial crisis. The Trump recovery was 2.5%. Trump had more rapid economic growth. And to give you an idea what this difference means, inequality increased during the Obama years and was finally starting to come down during the Trump years. Simply because, yes, wages were rising at the bottom of the scale very rapidly during the last year or two of that administration. And that is well documented. That's well documented. Simply, the best antidote for most social problems is simply a better job market. What's the potential for 3.3% economic growth again? the same potential as me playing for the New York Yankees at 72. Let me explain why. No matter what you do, no matter how you jigger the equation, the economy cannot grow more rapidly over the cycle than the sum of labor force growth and population growth. Annual labor productivity growth from 89 to 2009 was 2.4%. Since then, it's been about 1.2. And labor force growth, because of lower fertility rates, the fertility rate just didn't go down this year. It's been doing this for 2 decades. And there's a lot of reasons, and that's a subject of this discussion. But with that kind of fertility, those kinds of fertility rates, eventually you're going to have low labor force growth, unless you accept a great deal of immigration. And it doesn't do you any good to have an open border with Mexico, because you don't need any more chauffeurs and sandwich makers. You have to basically import people who are going to fill places where the economy can grow. You don't have, that doesn't mean necessarily software engineers and civil engineers, but it does mean people who can fill tech jobs, you know, at the level of a technician at least, because that's where the pinches are. Highly skilled factory workers and things of that nature. So what are the remedies? Well, everybody's got a remedy, and they all boil down to taxes, spending, and regulation. And getting that mix right. The economy does not function without regulation, and it doesn't function very well with too much regulation. It's like you don't live very long if you don't eat, and you don't live a very long time if you eat too much. Federal support for R&D during this productivity slowdown over the last several decades has been declining, while the Chinese have been increasing their support for R&D. Those are hard numbers, and those are numbers that both political parties have their fingerprints on. A lot of these problems, both parties have their fingerprints on. The labor force, boosting fertility is very, very important, but it isn't going to do you any good for 18 years. You know, not unless we go back to child labor practices. Immigration helps, but it doesn't help to import workers that don't meet needs that you have. Chain immigration, for example, where somebody comes here and they're a software engineer and they bring 18 relatives without skills, does not help. Immigration policy has to be highly focused, and the kinds of reforms that have been suggested by people that want to focus on labor force needs, guess who has policies like that? Canada. Canada is hardly a hotbed of conservative thinking. All the children of conservatives from the Diefenbaker years now live in America. I mean, the only place I feel more lonely than when I'm at Berkeley is when I'm at the University of Toronto. You know, there they want to put me under glass and observe, you know, this now extinct, you know, professorial life form. Nobody in this room is going to like this. We don't do the kind of work we used to do. You know, even if you work at a warehouse, I worked at a warehouse when I was a young guy. One of the many, many jobs I did going through college. And we actually had to pick up the boxes and put them on shelves. People don't do that anymore. When they built the Empire State Building, people actually did carry bricks up on those wooden poles with the V's, and they don't do that anymore. People can work longer. People can even serve in the military longer. Because once you become a major, your days of leading the patrol out in the, you don't do that anymore. You could extend the military retirement age, for example, to 25 years, and extend the period of time between promotions, adjust pay in other ways to compensate and so forth. We really need people to work longer. And I don't mean to 66 or 60, well, we're adjusting up to 67. I mean like 70. Most people can work that long. Even, you know, working in a kitchen, when I was working at that McDonald's, there was no air conditioning. Today, it's air conditioned. That makes a big difference in how you take heat at 50. My high school wasn't air conditioned. Maybe that's why I didn't do very well. I always thought it was spring. Being more open to things like robotics, artificial intelligence, big data would be very useful. There's been a natural resistance to this because it puts people out of work. We've had people who want to make robots illegal in California cities so as to maintain employment. Well, think about if we had done that. That would mean sort of like, in order to maintain Teamsters, we should have never had trucks. Okay? Technological progress is the story of eliminating jobs and creating new ones. The trick is to grow fast enough that as you eliminate jobs, you create new positions, and that over a generation, you train people differently so that you have a more productive society. That is the name of the game. And that does not necessarily mean sending 60% of your high school graduates to college. Now, Biden's Build Back Better agenda. We have two bills working their way through Congress. The $1.1 trillion infrastructure bill, which really consists of a little bit more than $500 billion in new money, and the $3.5 trillion bill, which has all the social programs. Everything that's in his two original proposals, the American Recovery Act and the American Jobs Plan, the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, are in one of those two bills in some form or another. The first one was the stimulus in March. They have these undergirding objectives to redress income inequality by direct government action as opposed to relying on growth, to accomplish greater racial justice and gender equality. Those are stated goals. And if you look at the Infrastructure Act, they're laced all through it. You know, certain projects have to be done because they're in certain neighborhoods and so forth. To address climate change, basically promote green industries and electric cars. And this is the biggest blue sky of them all. His climate change czar, who ran for president unsuccessfully, told people that when the pipeline wasn't going to get built, that they could get jobs in green industries. The electric car has 40% fewer moving parts, requires less maintenance, and once it's built, it's like your washing machine. Other than you'll have to change your brakes and tires. Doesn't require oil changes, doesn't have antifreeze, things like all that dirty stuff. None of that stuff goes on anymore. The electric car will just use many fewer workers. Absolutely. The only way that we are going to have as many people in the UAW today, 20 years from now, is that they require all the components to be made here, and they require by law that they be made by union workers. The reality is most of the changes that they want to implement will destroy union jobs. You know, the pipeline would have had a lot of union labor, but we don't want those things. Instead, we're going to import oil we're going to beg Saudi Arabia to pump more oil because their oil's clean and ours is not so. The American Jobs Plan, you've read about the infrastructure programs over and over again. Basically, transportation and infrastructure. Things like water programs and so forth, in addition to roads and bridges and airports and whatnot. There's also a significant component to boost manufacturing and small businesses. That's the other thing. We have this love affair with small businesses. Small businesses are important, but they're no more dynamic or less dynamic than big businesses. After all, who was riding in those private, shoot 'em up, those space rides recently? Those were not small businessmen. They just weren't. Some things cannot be done by serial entrepreneurs, like build space capsules. And some things can't be done very well by the government. Musk and company over there, they have spacesuits, okay? NASA pays $500 billion for $1 million for each spacesuit. He can't afford that. So he just makes it more efficiently. The problem with spacesuits is we make them like we do military bases. A little piece has to be made there, a little piece has to be made here, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very inefficient. But it basically focuses on 4 industries: pharmaceuticals, because of the shortages of critical materials we had during the pandemic; semiconductors; EVs, but especially batteries. The Chinese are ahead on batteries, period. We're all in a race for the quickly rechargeable, long-lasting battery, and that doesn't go on fire like the Bolt, and critical materials. Those rare earth minerals and things that go into the new light bulbs and LEDs and all that. It ignores a lot of industries where the Chinese are subsidizing, protecting domestic markets, and so forth. For example, in the area of petrochemicals, they still import a lot of petrochemicals. They're building new refineries so that they won't have to do that. Electric grid and water infrastructure. Most of this is city water. Take the lead out of the pipes in Michigan and so forth. We need about $85 billion to improve resilience in the West from what is now a 21-year running drought. That is the second worst drought we've had since the year 800. This is what's going on in the West is not a millennial event. It's something that's going to happen frequently. The private sector says it needs $85 billion. The infrastructure bill devotes $8 billion. The money's in the wrong place. There are things that happen in the West that can no longer happen in the East. For example, we get a lot of our vegetables from there. And where we used to get our vegetables in the East from is now suburban housing on Long Island. And what's more, you will not be getting very much lettuce, no matter how much farmland they dig up in the Connecticut Valley, from Vermont in the month of January. In the end, we'll import that stuff from Chile and Mexico, assuming they have enough water. High-speed internet, more federal support for R&D. There is some effort to turn around the downward chart there. The improvements in the electrical grid, as I pointed out, and the rest you've already heard, education, childcare, and so forth. The social programs consist of things like universal pre-K. You've heard about all this. Basically, we're going to provide families that earn less than $150,000 a year with a child rearing allowance. That will probably happen no matter how things work out, simply because there's Republican support for that. The plan that Mitt Romney tabled before Biden ran, or while Biden was running, is very similar to Biden's program. So that's probably going to happen. With things like, say, the additional support for childcare while you're working, probably won't help very much. And the reason being is, if we start subsidizing childcare, we'll just raise the price of it, like we did higher education. And it won't do very much at all to change the fertility rate. We have significant evidence of that these kinds of programs, childcare allowances and just child allowances, do not move the fertility rate in Europe, because it's been tried. The basic reason is that once people start careers, they take on almost a spiritual existence in their lives. And everything else becomes subordinated to it, because they identify their self-worth with it. And so that parenting becomes less important. And we just wait for someone else to have the children. It's that simple. The only place programs like that have worked is places with very strong Catholic or Orthodox cultures. In France, Quebec, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. Those programs have moved the needle. Every place else they've tried, they've hardly moved the needle at all. Because there's two ways to look at them. One is we're helping you raise your child. The other is we're making it easier for you to work. The Chinese have it down on this. The problem is the cost of raising a child and the arms race to get into Harvard. Increasingly, the wages earned by the top quarter of college graduates, you want to see income inequality? The difference between the top quarter and the bottom quarter is becoming dramatically larger. Where you go to school and what you study profoundly affects what you'll earn at 40, 50, and 60. Because if you study sociology or art history or foreign affairs at Plattsburgh State, you are destined to a life in low quality, low paying jobs. By the way, I went to Plattsburgh State, but I studied economics. Okay? Those degrees in your generation paid out because you basically went into a world that just wanted college graduates and you learned the business in the business. And it was very big corporate oriented. Those days are over. But you know, when you take your kid to school and they say, I want to major in French history, the Humanities College will roll out the biography of someone who's become the CEO of a company who 40 years ago graduated with a degree in French history from the University of Maryland. We have one of those, we have people like that we can roll out. They don't roll out the photographs of all the people that are basically still stamping books at a library at a small college in Texas. Girl down the street from me where I grew up is doing that. A small college in Texas. Taxes and regulation. You're well aware he's going to raise taxes on people, basically couples that earn more than about $520,000, $530,000. That's the proposal. So that meets your $400,000 a year. It really doesn't if one party earns 195 and the other earns the balance, but that's what they want to do. Not all of these taxes are going to pass. And the more aggressive enforcement we've tried in the past and doesn't work. Money has a way of finding other places to go, of hiding. Consequently, either the impact on the deficit is going to be much larger or the programs are going to be much smaller. Just the infrastructure program is going through Congress under regular order. So it doesn't have to be balanced. It doesn't have to generate, it was supposed to generate enough revenue to pay for itself, but as you saw in the papers a few days ago, it only comes up with about half the new money that's being spent. Okay? This does to go through by reconciliation. So either they break the rules, they raise some of the taxes a lot more because other taxes are unpopular and they can't get them through Congress, like the step up on capital gains. I don't think that has much chance of passing in a Congress where you have car dealers and people who own family farms, because between step up and a tougher inheritance estate tax, you won't have any money left to give your kids at all on anything over the new estate tax limit that they propose, which will be about $11,000 per couple, 11 million per couple. It's now around 22. They want to cut it back to what it used to be. So they're not all going to pass. So one of the two things, what's going to happen is either we're going to have fewer of those programs, we're going to have a very different structure and a very much more progressive income tax, or they're going to spend less money, or the deficit's going to go up and so on. My betting is it's going to be a little bit of each, and we're looking at deficits of about 200 trillion, 250, 200, 2 trillion, 2.5 trillion a year for the rest of this decade, once we come out of the pandemic. That's what we're looking at. Okay? What that means is the next time there is a national crisis, we will have to run deficits of 5.5, 6 trillion to solve them. Also, we're up against a significant Chinese naval buildup in the Pacific, and the defense budget is slated to fall in real terms. That is going to get addressed. What Biden is doing is putting it out there and forcing the Republicans, and to some extent, centrist Democrats, there are Democrats that worry about these things, to carry the weight, because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party does not want to address the defense spending issue. Okay? Now, what this basically means is that we've fundamentally changed how we run the country. We used to be for basically open markets and deregulation, balanced budgets, the integrity of the currency and so forth, and free trade. Over the last 2 or 3 presidencies, we've wavered from free trade, we're regulating more, and we've evolved into an easy money policy. Most of the pandemic relief was funded by the Fed printing money to buy the bonds the Treasury issued. One of the reasons the interest on the national debt has not been exploding is the Federal Reserve has been buying the bonds. So when the Federal Reserve owns the bonds, the Treasury pays the Federal Reserve the interest. Then at the end of the year, the Federal Reserve remits its profits back to the Treasury. So the money simply round trips. The debt held by the public has not gone up that much. But now we're going to be in a situation where the Fed can't keep printing money because of the inflation we're getting, and we're going to have a crisis. So what does all this mean? We're likely facing slower population growth, and we're going to have more immigration. We're going to have a permanently downsized labor force. We're going to have slower economic growth, more inflation. And when you have slow economic growth, history teaches us you get more inequality, not less. Think of all the things Barack Obama tried to do for poor folks and minorities, and their situation continued to decline. This is just doubling down on that policy. In the end, you cannot make people better off by merely printing money and giving it to them, because money that is not earned just turns into inflation. And let's face it, people like you and I know how to deal with that. They don't. The other thing is it probably means that there's going to be even greater pressure on things like Social Security. When we were kids, our parents, grandparents weren't paying taxes on 85% of their Social Security. We are. I'm almost certain you're going to have higher Medicare premiums. And we are going to be weaker militarily because we won't have any money to spend on the Navy. And we will have less ability to assert ourselves in Asia through our inherent credibility and our how well the system works. Because after all, we've seen in the last week how well the system works. What happened in the last week in Afghanistan has a much more powerful consequence for the United States beyond what is happening to the poor people in Afghanistan. We're asking the Indians, the Chinese, the Koreans, the Australians to beef up their navies because we can't afford to do it simply by ourselves, even if we did adequately fund it. Because China is so large, it's got 4 times as many people, and it just pays less for everything. How much confidence can they have when the fuse gets lit that the Americans will be there after this last week? We had an administration whose priorities were someplace else. We had an administration whose priorities are someplace else. This administration is in the habit of redefining the objectives in the face of failure. On the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the basic problem is the Germans buy more gas, the Russians can use that to build more missiles. So he redefined the problem to say, well, the real issue here is that the Ukraine gets some revenue from selling gas to the West. So he gets a promise from Angela Merkel, which she wanted all along, to continue buying gas through the Ukraine pipeline, but she's also going to buy it through Nord Stream 2, which means they're going to buy much more gas from Russia, which Russia can use to build up its military. And how are the Germans depending on protecting themselves? With the American army. Okay? If the objective of the United States in Afghanistan was to get rid of bin Laden, then why have we been there all these years since he's been dead? Since the end of the first term of Barack Obama. Why? The answer is our objective was nation building and the spread of democracy and all the rest. We have failed at that. An absence of honesty can be characterized by people telling another story. And to just say, well, we've accomplished our objective and conducted ourselves appropriately, and if the country falls apart, that's not our problem. Well, we made it our problem. How can they rely on us? And this happens over and over again with politicians, but in this case of this particular politician, it happens with big things. So a slower growing economy, more poverty, diminished resources for the military, and we are facing probably war in Asia within the next 5 years, 7 years. President Xi's got 5 to 7 years to go. Right now, as I'm standing here, I can guarantee you if he crosses the Straits of Taiwan, we will lose, simply because the American aircraft carriers can't get close enough. That is the consequence of a slow-growing American economy. Now, think about Taiwan falling. Where did the chips ultimately come from? Taiwan. All of a sudden, he's got the choke point, not on oil, but on chips. If you don't have an adequately growing economy, you cannot promote equality. You cannot promote better living standards for the people at the bottom. You can't defend yourself. And the way your grandchildren will live will be profoundly affected. This is no longer a fight over whether you pay more taxes. This is a fight now over whether your grandchildren can live in dignity and peace, whether they are subjugated. That's what this comes down to. This is a national security issue of the highest order. And I'll leave it at that. I'll give you a parting thought. They don't call it the dismal science for nothing. You got some questions? Somebody must have a question. Yeah.
Passed over the guaranteed income.
Yeah, actually, there's a mic here. Let me have the microphone. I'll hear, we'll do the, here you go. Say it again for everyone to hear.
Well, he passed over the subject of the guaranteed income. What do you think of that?
Well, actually, if you get his program, you got it. If you piece together the child care allowance, enhanced food stamps, the child care allowance, Section 8 housing, and so on and so forth, you're pretty well there. You're just doing it, do I serve you a meal where you pay a certain amount of money and I give you a salad, a protein, a starch, and some vegetables and a dessert? Or do I give you a buffet? But at the buffet, you don't get to choose. You get a salad, you just pick it up one at a time. In a lot of ways, a guaranteed income would be more efficient than all this stuff because you wouldn't have all this administrative overhead. But remember, if you do that, you won't have jobs for his supporters that have been produced by very liberal universities and these people who really, a lot of people working in the government really can't do much anything else other than give away other people's money. And I don't know what you would do with those people, so I don't know that that's going to happen. Another question? You pick them out. Did you turn me back on? Okay. One of the reasons we don't have as much public transportation on the poor side of town is because we don't have as many commuters. What drives public transportation is not people going shopping, it's people going to work. If you were growing at 3%, you'd have more public transportation on the poor side of town. You would. Well, I grew up on the poor side of town. We had public transportation because everybody got up in the morning and went to work. I don't know that giving people more food stamps, which by the way, I support. I think the food stamp allowance is inadequate. I think it's shamefully inadequate. I don't know that that's going to solve the problem of Safeway not wanting to relocate there. And the question is, do you force Safeway to open a store on the poor side of town when they lose money there? That's an important question. How far do we take that? I mean, it's interesting to point that out, but what is the solution that you would advocate? Another question? I made my tenure writing about the benefits of free trade agreements. I am Mr. Free Trade Agreements. Don't have any of them with China. I have published articles basically saying, in fact, in the Washington Times a couple of weeks ago, that we should re-enter the TPP. And one aspect of the TPP is that you're out of the TPP if you negotiate a free trade agreement with China. Basically, the problem is China. The WTO works perfectly well. The last administration really had problems. One of the problems that we have at USTR is the last administration and this administration have had lawyers that work on the import side, people that represent importers in dumping cases. They don't like free trade agreements. It's that simple. Mr. Lighthizer and I have had numerous headbutting disputes. And when Kudlow would have me to the White House, the last time I got quite a lecture about what I had been writing on that subject for Mr. Lighthizer, but it was a good-natured thing. We can disagree and still be friends, which we are. But I like free trade agreements. I just don't like China inside them because they exploit the hell out of them. See, the free trade agreements are kind of like speeding laws. If everybody does 90 miles an hour, what's the state troopers going to do? China's so large and commits so many errors that it's impossible to effectively enforce them through dispute settlement mechanisms that those trade agreements provide. It's just not possible. So I'm for free trade, just not with China or Iran or Russia. And you can throw in North Korea and a couple of other rogue states. Probably the new Libya by the end of the week. Yeah.
Could you repeat again what you said about the pipeline decisions?
The pipeline decisions were very poor decisions because the pace at which we reduce our consumption of oil is not governed by how much oil we pump in America or how much we bring down from Canada. It's a function of our ability to build out the electric vehicle infrastructure and bring down the price and increase the capacity of batteries. That is not at all affected by the price of gasoline because Detroit has already made the decision to go electric. They're no longer developing new internal combustion engines, but there's just flat out scientific limitations that all the money in the world can't change. They're making progress every day, but they're not making it fast enough. So if you shut down pipelines or don't let them get built here, all it means is that you have to import more oil from Saudi Arabia and other unsavory places. And we've seen how oil money can be used to our great benefit abroad. It can't be used to our benefit abroad very well at all. Not at all. So really, do you want to buy oil from terrorists or do you want to buy oil from, Alberta? That's what it comes down to. The other thing is that it did deprive some Americans of jobs in that industry, in addition to oil, in the steel industry, in the construction industry, and so forth. And I think that's just silly policy. I'm not a global warming denier. I'm not at all. And I've gotten a lot of heat from my Republican and conservative friends for early on saying, I've been to the glaciers in Norway. Only an idiot would say that the climate's not warming. But you don't solve your basic climate change problem by sourcing your oil from Saudi Arabia instead of Alberta.
Eric.
Yeah.
You didn't comment on India. India will have more people in the next generation than China does. And it seems to me that if we're looking forward in the world, we have to locate where India will be.
India has got serious problems in terms of developing itself. India has extraordinary inequality problems. It has a great deal of corruption, and it has a lot of trouble innovating outside the software sector. India is of interest to us primarily because it has a lot of people. That's why, and they have a border with the Chinese that's a tense border, so it makes them a natural ally. Because they're very large, even though they're not very wealthy, they're rather poor, that does give them the capacity to contribute to a naval capability in that part of the world that we need. And also anything that puts pressure on China right now. It's the old story, is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Because remember, the Indians historically have not been favorably disposed towards the United States. And to some extent, the Chinese are changing that. And so that has to just sort of run its course. But the Indian economic development problems are largely for the Indians to solve. Another question? Yeah.
Well, it's twofold. What with the two, With the $2.5 trillion a year going into debt, what's going to happen to the value of the US currency is a world currency? It's gone.
Well, we've gotten away with printing a lot more money than we thought we could get away with printing, say 10 to 20 years ago. Because for one thing is China's making itself the other place where there's asset growth, an increasingly unattractive place to invest. Because, you know, you can wake up one morning and President Xi decides that, you know, DD is no good and, you know, or tutoring is no good and your stock values are wiped out. I mean, any investment advisor that tells you to invest in China, just get another investment advisor. It's that simple. Don't report him to the local insanity people because they've already got enough people to lock up. You know, really, but don't invest in China. Where else are you going to invest your money? Europe doesn't grow. So the third world is highly unstable. So the United States is a place where you can put your money. The other thing is that the global population is aging and amassing a lot of savings. And so there's a large appetite for US denominated assets. And some of that will be satisfied by US bonds, by Treasury securities. So there's a natural appetite for a growth in the US debt. Whether it's $2 trillion a year remains to be seen. Right now, we don't know what it is because the Fed has been printing the money to cover the new bonds. Basically, the Treasury issues the bonds and the Fed goes out and buys them and puts them on the books. Then the Treasury pays the Fed the interest. And then at the end of the year, the Fed sends the interest back. The interest on the national debt it gets interesting though, because of the pressure of inflation, which is now with us. When the Fed starts raising interest rates, then the bill on the publicly held debt will go up because the Treasury will have to pay a higher interest rate. At that point, with the kind of debt we have, the next president is going to have a headache. He's going to have a headache because he's going to wake up in next year's budget. He's more constrained than this year's budget without spending a nickel more. There are two ways the debt can come back and bite us. One is rising interest rates to get people to buy the stuff, and that's how that'll happen. And the other is if we just print money to cover it, we'll get inflation. So my feeling is that probably we're going to see it not so much in the dollar falling vis-a-vis other currencies, because there's no other currency to buy. We're going to see it in the diminished value of certain assets in the United States, like retirement assets and so forth. After all, I have to keep a certain amount of my money in fixed income, near dollar, near liquid, whatever, because the market could crash tomorrow. Something could happen. People could panic over Afghanistan. And then we go through a 5-year period where it would be foolish for me to cash out stocks. So I have to rely on my, so that money is losing value right now because of this inflation. Another question?
One more question.
The dollar is not going to be backed by gold. All the gold that's ever been mined essentially is still on the surface of the earth, except a few teeth in graves. And there's simply not enough gold in the world to back up all the currency needs. Okay, there's not enough gold in the world to back up our currencies. It's that simple. The biggest threat to the dollar as a reserve currency is the fact that the Federal Reserve won't move towards digital dollars, because that would make the economy profoundly more efficient. And nothing would make the US look worse. Well, I shouldn't say that anymore. I can't imagine that anything could make the US look worse than the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the director of Middle East policy, and the next guy down on the chain telling the president that the Afghan regime will collapse if you pull out in this hasty fashion, and the president doing it. It's kind of hard to top that one. It really is. As tragic as it is, I don't mean that. I know it's funny sounding, but it's really sad. But what's even worse is we have a lawyer in charge at the Federal Reserve who thinks his job is to basically represent the president. So he's been telling you inflation is very transitory. He still thinks if he convinces 12 people his client's innocent, that's all that matters. That'll become reality. The economy doesn't work that way. He is, the guy who really never wants to do anything at work. He just wants to keep the paper moving. Nothing would make the Federal Reserve have to work harder or think outside the box more than a digital currency. So he keeps saying, oh, we want to get it right. We don't want to do it fast. Well, what are they doing about it? The Chinese will have a digital currency. And that is the single thing that could displace the dollar, because a digital currency would be profoundly more efficient than the currency system we have now. When you make a purchase, you guys send me a check for coming here. I take it to my bank. The bank has to process that. And the way it processes it goes, to my bank, to a clearinghouse, to your bank, and down again and back and up again. Okay? If we had a digital currency, when Paul paid me, they would have just moved the money from the committee here for balance from their account. No, you can't. In fact, I was paid in advance because some. No, it's been cashed. It has been cashed. It has been cashed. I did a group in Chicago where I said we really have to do something about raising the birth rate, and the target rate number of children has to be greater than 2. And a bunch of young women really got angry, and I was never invited back again. But that's the honest truth. You have to have more babies to raise the birth rate, to stop the decline of population. That we have to start to have a dialogue about how we have more children. Okay. But whenever I broach that, wow, the rockets go off and clients leave. So you always get paid in advance. Remember that when you give speeches. But the point is that if we had a digital currency, the check, all they would have done was I would have put it in my account at the Federal Reserve, and the money would have been moved directly from this committee's account to there. It's like the 3% you always lose when you use a credit card wouldn't exist anymore. It's like all the money you save by using email instead of the post office. If the Chinese have that, and they can peg their currency 1-to-1 to the dollar, so to speak, they can peg it, which they can do because they're a surplus current account. They can do that, then that's what could displace the dollar. So what's the threat to the US dollar? It's a lawyer at the Federal Reserve who may be the best clerk. What did the Montgomery say about Eisenhower? Okay. He really is lazy about this. And I think if there's any reason to make a change to the Federal Reserve, that's it. Because that's a real threat to the reserve currency. And that is a powerful American weapon that we don't want to give up. And my ambivalence about lawyers at the Federal Reserve will go away as soon as the next economist is nominated to the United States Supreme Court. And on numerous occasions, I've suggested on TV, a likely candidate, someone who's underemployed, unappreciated at the University of Maryland, who's got time on his hands, who could adequately adjudicate these disputes.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank
let's
you.
hear it for Peter Morici.